Maria grew up in a neighborhood where dreams were often overshadowed by the harsh reality of daily life. It was a place where opportunities seemed like fleeting whispers, spoken about but rarely seen. Her family lived paycheck to paycheck, and every month was a struggle to make ends meet. From a young age, Maria learned the value of hard work, but she also learned that hard work didn't always guarantee a way out. As a young black girl in this environment, she was constantly reminded of her place, whether through sideways glances or the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle comments about what someone like her could achieve. Despite this, Maria was a fighter. She had a fire in her that burned brighter than the limitations placed upon her. That fire first ignited the day she saw a judo demonstration at her local community center. She watched in awe as the athletes moved with grace and power, flipping their opponents effortlessly. For a moment, she was transported out of her surroundings and into a world where strength and discipline meant everything. It wasn't just the physical aspect that drew her in, it was the respect and dignity each judoka carried. They bowed to one another before and after each match, acknowledging the fight they were about to engage in. Maria felt an immediate connection to this silent yet powerful language of the sport. The very next day, she begged her mother to let her join the judo classes at the community center. Her mother hesitated at first. They had little money to spare, and the idea of her daughter engaging in a martial art seemed like a distant luxury. But Maria was relentless, her eyes gleaming with a determination that her mother had not seen before. Finally, they struck a deal. Maria would help out more around the house and pick up small chores in the neighborhood to contribute to the judo fees. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Maria's first day on the tatami was nothing short of life-changing. The dojo was small and worn, with mats that had seen better days. But to Maria, it was a sanctuary. The sensei, a stern but kind man, welcomed her with a simple nod. There were no questions about where she came from or what she wanted to prove. All that mattered was her willingness to learn. And learn she did. From the first time she tied the white belt around her waist, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced before. The first few weeks were tough. Her body ached from the rigorous training, and the moves were far more complex than they had appeared in that demonstration. She was thrown to the ground countless times, her breath knocked out of her, but each time she got back up. Sensei often said that judo wasn't just about throwing your opponent. It was about learning how to fall and get back up again. That lesson resonated with Maria in ways she hadn't expected. Every fall reminded her of the times life had knocked her down, and every time she stood back up, it was a testament to her inner strength. Maria's commitment didn't go unnoticed. Despite the odds, she showed up to every practice, her resolve growing stronger with each passing day. As the months turned into years, her skills began to sharpen. She moved with a fluidity and precision that caught the eye of her sensei and others in the dojo. It wasn't just her physical abilities that stood out. It was her attitude. She trained not for glory, but for the sense of empowerment that judo gave her. For the first time in her life, she felt she had control over something, even if it was just her own body. Outside the dojo, things weren't as encouraging. School was a daily reminder of the world's harsh judgments. Classmates would snicker and whisper behind her back, questioning why she, a girl, and a black girl at that, would even bother with a sport like judo. Wasn't that a boy's sport? Wasn't she better off doing something else, something more appropriate? But every time doubt crept in, she channeled it into her training. Every disparaging remark fueled her desire to break every stereotype thrown her way. Her family, though initially skeptical, began to see the changes in Maria. She was more disciplined, more focused. The girl who used to come home with a slumped posture now walked with her head held high. Judo was doing more than teaching her self-defense. It was teaching her self-worth. Her mother, watching her daughter's transformation, realized that this sport was not a distraction, but a path to something greater. As Maria advanced through the ranks, earning her colored belts one by one, she started to see a future for herself that didn't involve the limitations of her neighborhood. She saw a future where she could represent her community on a larger stage, not just as a judoka, but as a symbol of what could be achieved with grit and determination. Every time she bowed at the end of a practice, she wasn't just bowing to her sensei or her peers. She was bowing to the challenges she had faced and the ones she was yet to conquer. Judo became more than a sport. It became her lifeline. It was the one place where the color of her skin and her gender didn't determine her worth. On the tatami, she was judged by her skill, her discipline, and her spirit. And as she stood there, drenched in sweat, staring down yet another opponent, she knew that this was only the beginning of her journey. Maria's journey in judo was anything but smooth. As she progressed from a white belt to the higher ranks, the challenges grew tougher, not just physically, but also mentally. In the dojo, her skills were undeniable. She moved with a blend of power and grace that made her a formidable opponent, even to those who had been training longer. Her sensei saw a natural talent in her, something that went beyond just physical ability. It was a mental resilience, an unbreakable spirit. He began to push her harder, recognizing that Maria had the potential to compete at a national level. While her abilities were sharpening, so were the whispers outside the dojo. As Maria started participating in local tournaments, she encountered a different kind of opponent: prejudice. In these early competitions, she was often one of the few girls on the mat, and almost always the only black girl. Parents, coaches, and even fellow competitors would give her sidelong glances, questioning her presence there. Sometimes it was subtle, a dismissive shrug or a look of surprise when she won a match. Other times it was more overt, like when she overheard a competitor's coach tell his student, "Don't worry, she's just a girl. You've got this." Maria learned to use these moments as fuel. Every time someone doubted her, it added fire to her already intense drive. She trained longer and harder, pushing herself to the brink of exhaustion, knowing that her victories weren't just for her, they were for every girl who had been told she couldn't, and for every black athlete who had been overlooked. She was fighting to redefine what people thought was possible for someone like her. Her dedication paid off. She started winning local tournaments, and soon enough, she was making a name for herself in the regional circuit. Her technique was clean and precise, but it was her tenacity that set her apart. She didn't just compete, she dominated. Maria's name began to circulate in judo communities, and whispers of her talent reached beyond the regional scene. But with recognition came more scrutiny. There were still those who believed she was an anomaly, a fluke, and they were quick to attribute her success to luck or circumstance rather than skill and hard work. Despite the growing resistance, Maria kept her focus. She knew the power of perseverance. Her sensei, aware of the hurdles she faced, supported her both on and off the mat. He didn't just teach her throws and holds. He taught her how to carry herself with dignity in the face of ignorance. "Let your judo speak for you," he would say. And so she did. Maria's rise in judo wasn't just a personal achievement, it was a statement. It was proof that talent knows no boundaries of race or gender. With each competition, she shattered preconceived notions, not by talking back to her doubters, but by defeating every opponent they put in front of her. The more she won, the harder it became for others to deny her place in the sport. Yet the prejudice never fully went away. It simply evolved. As she climbed higher, now competing on national stages, she faced a different kind of skepticism. Some questioned her authenticity, suggesting that she was getting opportunities merely because she was a symbol rather than a legitimate athlete. Others insinuated that her victories were somehow less valid because of her background. But Maria didn't let these comments break her. If anything, they solidified her resolve. She knew what she had sacrificed to get here, and she wasn't about to let anyone diminish her accomplishments. Her family, initially uncertain about her dedication to judo, became her biggest supporters. They traveled with her to competitions when they could, cheering loudly from the stands. Her mother especially was her rock. She watched with pride as her daughter defied every expectation placed on her. Maria's victories were victories for the whole family, for their community, and for anyone who had ever felt that the odds were stacked against them. Maria's journey wasn't just about winning medals. It was about claiming her space in a world that had tried to limit her. Each time she stepped onto the mat, she was aware of the weight she carried, the expectations and stereotypes she was constantly battling against. But she had learned long ago how to channel that pressure. To Maria, every match was more than just a fight. It was a chance to prove to herself and to the world that she was exactly where she belonged. As Maria continued to compete, she caught the attention of national coaches and sponsors. They recognized in her not just a talented athlete, but a trailblazer. Invitations to higher-level tournaments started coming in, and with them, new challenges. But Maria was ready. She had spent years refining her skills, not just to win, but to stand tall in the face of every challenge that came her way. Her journey in judo was far from over. She knew that the path ahead would bring even greater tests, both on the mat and off it. But Maria was prepared. She had been fighting her whole life, not just against opponents in a dojo, but against the narrow definitions of who she was allowed to be. And she was winning. As Maria's reputation grew, so did the attention around her. News outlets began to take notice of the young judoka who was breaking barriers and setting new standards in the sport. Interviews, magazine features, and local TV spots became more frequent, each one presenting her as a symbol of hope and change. In these interviews, Maria spoke openly about her journey, the challenges she faced, and how judo had shaped her into the person she was. She talked about her passion for the sport, her commitment to discipline, and her dream of inspiring the next generation of athletes, especially young girls and children of color. Despite the recognition, prejudice was never far behind. In almost every competition, there were reminders that, to some, she still didn't belong. It wasn't always in the open. Often, it lingered in the subtle comments, the whispers in the stands, the narrowed eyes of those who doubted her worth. Sometimes, it was in the way people would talk about her victories, attributing them to luck, or suggesting that her opponents hadn't been at their best. There were even times when she was told outright that her presence made others uncomfortable, as if her success somehow disrupted the established order of things. The deeper Maria ventured into the world of competitive judo, the more she realized how ingrained these attitudes were. At a regional championship, after an intense match where she claimed the gold, Maria overheard a conversation between two coaches. "She's good, but let's see how long it lasts," one of them remarked. The other nodded, adding, "She's making a name for herself now, but this isn't her world. It's a phase." Those words stung. It wasn't enough that she trained just as hard, if not harder, than her peers. To some, her victories were anomalies, exceptions to the rule rather than proof that the boundaries they believed in were flawed. Maria felt the weight of their words, but instead of letting them diminish her, she used them as a reminder of why she fought so fiercely. Every judgment, every dismissive comment only fueled her resolve to push further, to make her mark undeniable. She also began to notice how she was treated differently in the media. While her male counterparts were often praised purely for their skill and dedication, Maria's narrative was frequently framed around her identity. Headlines would focus on her being a black female judoka, as if those aspects were the most remarkable parts of her story. Few delved into the technical prowess, the strategic brilliance she displayed on the mat. It was as though the world could not separate her achievements from her gender and race. To many, she was an inspiration, more for existing in that space than for excelling in it. The duality of her experience weighed on Maria. On one hand, she was proud to represent so much more than just herself every time she stepped onto the mat. But on the other, she longed to be seen for her abilities first, to be recognized as a skilled athlete rather than a symbol. There were moments when the constant need to prove herself, to be both exceptional and a role model, felt exhausting. In private, she grappled with these emotions, questioning why it had to be this way. Why her success couldn't simply be celebrated without the caveats and the backhanded compliments. However, Maria was not one to be defeated by prejudice. She had grown accustomed to walking a path laden with obstacles, and she knew that the road to change was often fraught with resistance. Instead of shrinking in the face of this scrutiny, she stood taller. She continued to share her story, not just to inspire others, but to challenge the narratives that tried to box her in. She began to talk more openly about the biases in the sport, calling attention to the ways in which women, especially women of color, were often sidelined or minimized. Her voice became as powerful as her presence on the mat, and people started to listen. Maria's supporters rallied around her, recognizing the importance of her fight. Her community saw her not only as a champion in judo, but as a champion for change. She received messages from young girls and boys who saw in her a reflection of their own dreams. They wrote to her about how seeing someone like them excel in such a competitive sport gave them hope that they too could break through the barriers in their own lives. This growing support network helped Maria navigate the negativity that still occasionally crept into her world. She learned to focus on the positive impacts she was making, on the faces in the crowd who cheered for her, not just because she was different, but because she was excellent. For every sneer or whispered slight, there were cheers and words of encouragement that reminded her of the greater purpose she served. Maria knew that the fight against prejudice was a long one, and she accepted that her journey would continue to be one of both triumph and struggle. But if her presence in the sport could help shift even a few minds, could open even a few doors for those who would come after her, then every challenge she faced was worth it. She was no longer just a judoka. She was a force for change, and that made every step of her journey, every bit of resistance and every hard-earned victory, all the more significant. The day of the international competition had finally arrived. This was the event Maria had been preparing for her entire career, a chance to compete on a stage where the best athletes from around the world would come together. It was more than just another tournament. It was an opportunity to prove, once and for all, that she belonged among the elite in judo. Maria had spent months training for this moment, perfecting her techniques and pushing her body and mind to their limits. As she stood in the locker room, dressed in her gi and wrapping her hands, she took a deep breath. This was it. The arena was packed with spectators from all over the world. Flags of different nations waved in the stands, and the air was filled with the energy of eager anticipation. As Maria walked out to the mat, she could hear the murmurs of the crowd, some cheering for her, others watching with a sense of curiosity. She could feel their eyes on her, some supportive, others skeptical. But as she stepped onto the mat, she blocked out everything except the task at hand. In that moment, it was just her and her opponent, the culmination of years of training distilled into a few intense minutes. Her opponent was a formidable athlete from a country known for producing top-tier judokas. The match began, and the intensity was palpable. Maria and her opponent circled each other, searching for the perfect moment to strike. Every move was calculated, every muscle tense with the readiness to react. Maria's opponent was aggressive, launching into a series of attacks meant to throw her off balance. But Maria was prepared. She countered each move with precision, her body moving fluidly as she anticipated her opponent's strategies. The match was a grueling back and forth, with neither side willing to give an inch. For a while, it seemed like they were evenly matched. But Maria knew she had something her opponent did not, a resilience forged from years of fighting battles both on and off the mat. She waited for the right moment, biding her time as her opponent began to show signs of fatigue. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Maria executed a flawless throw, sending her opponent crashing to the mat. The crowd gasped, the referee signaled the point, and in that instant, Maria knew she had done it. As the referee raised her hand in victory, a surge of emotion washed over her. The cheers from the crowd were deafening, and for a moment she allowed herself to revel in the triumph. She had not just won a match. She had won a battle against every prejudice, every doubt, every voice that had told her she didn't belong. As she bowed to her opponent and the referee, Maria felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that went beyond the gold medal now being placed around her neck. When she stepped off the mat, her supporters swarmed around her, congratulating her on the victory. Her sensei was among them, his eyes shining with pride. He had seen her journey from the very beginning, from the little girl who walked into his dojo with fire in her eyes to the champion who now stood before him. "You did it," he said simply, and Maria nodded, knowing that those 3 words held the weight of everything she had worked for. News of her victory spread quickly. The media hailed her as a trailblazer, a symbol of perseverance and strength. Headlines flashed her name, and her story was broadcasted to a wider audience than ever before. Interviews were scheduled, and she was invited to prestigious events to celebrate her win. One such invitation was to a ceremony of recognition, an event that would bring together the country's most prominent athletes and dignitaries. It was an honor and a recognition of her accomplishments. But little did she know that this event would soon become the setting for one of the most defining moments of her journey. As Maria prepared for the ceremony, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. This win was more than just a medal. It was a statement. She had fought for her place not just in the sport, but in a society that often tried to define who she could be. And now, as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. With the victory behind her and the recognition ahead, Maria was on a high. Yet there was an underlying awareness that her fight wasn't over. There would always be those who questioned her, who sought to diminish her accomplishments because of her identity. But Maria had learned to meet such challenges with grace and strength. This upcoming ceremony would be a celebration of her triumphs, but it would also be a reminder that the world still had a long way to go in understanding what true equality looked like. And so, with her head held high and her heart steeled for whatever lay ahead, Maria walked forward, unaware that her greatest challenge was about to take place, not on the mat, but in a setting far less expected. The ceremony hall was grand, with gleaming chandeliers and elegantly set tables draped in white cloth. It was a place that exuded prestige, meant to honor the country's finest athletes in their contributions. As Maria arrived, dressed in an elegant gown that contrasted with her usual judo gi, she felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was supposed to be a night of celebration, a moment where she could bask in the recognition of her hard work. But as she entered the room, she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. Her entrance drew a mix of reactions. Some people smiled warmly, acknowledging her achievements, while others eyed her with a quiet skepticism. It was the same look she had seen so many times before, a questioning gaze that seemed to ask, "What is she doing here?" Maria was no stranger to these looks, but in this environment it felt different. It felt sharper, more cutting. She could hear the murmurs, the whispered conversations that paused as she walked by. Still, she held her head high, refusing to let the atmosphere affect her. The event was well underway, with athletes and dignitaries mingling and exchanging polite conversations. Maria spotted a few familiar faces, other athletes she had competed alongside in various tournaments. They greeted her with genuine warmth, congratulating her on her recent victory. For a moment, the tension eased, and she allowed herself to enjoy the celebration. She was led to her table, which was situated towards the front of the room, an indication of her status as one of the night's honorees. As she approached her seat, however, she noticed a man already standing near the table, staring at the seating card with a frown. He was tall, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, and he exuded an air of entitlement. Maria didn't know him, but she could tell from his expression that there was trouble brewing. When he saw her walking toward the table, his eyes narrowed with a look of disbelief. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I think there's been a mistake. This seat can't possibly be for you." Maria paused, taken aback by his words. She glanced at the card on the table. Her name was clearly printed there, next to his. "I'm sorry, but this is my assigned seat," she replied calmly. He let out a huff, looking around as if searching for someone to back him up. "You don't belong here," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "This event is for athletes of a certain caliber, and no offense, but people like you, well, this just isn't your place." A hush fell over the surrounding tables as people turned their attention to the unfolding scene. Maria felt a wave of heat rush through her body, a mix of anger and humiliation. She had faced prejudice before, but there was something about this moment, about the man's blatant dismissal of her, that struck a deeper chord. Here she was, a champion, invited to be honored, yet still having to justify her presence. The man continued, apparently emboldened by the silence of those around him. "This is the kind of event that maintains certain standards," he said, his tone carrying the weight of exclusion. "I don't know how you ended up here, but maybe they can find a more appropriate place for you." Maria clenched her jaw, feeling the sting of his words. She wanted to shout, to lash out, to make him see how wrong he was, but she knew that reacting with anger would only play into the very stereotypes he was casting upon her. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Years of discipline in judo had taught her to control her emotions, to use her mind as much as her body in moments of confrontation. The flight-or-fight instinct coursed through her veins, but Maria knew she needed to handle this differently. If she backed down now, she would be affirming every prejudice this man held. If she confronted him in anger, she risked becoming the angry black woman stereotype that society so often weaponized against people like her. She had to find another way, one that stayed true to who she was and what she stood for. Just as she was about to speak, the event's coordinator arrived, sensing the tension in the air. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between Maria and the man. "This woman," the man began, clearly choosing his words to sting, "seems to think she belongs at this table. There must have been a mistake." The coordinator glanced at Maria, then at the seating chart in her hand. "There is no mistake," she said firmly. "Miss Maria has been placed here because she is one of tonight's honored guests. We are here to celebrate her accomplishments." The man's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger, but he said nothing more. With a reluctant huff, he moved away from the table, finding another seat nearby. Maria could feel the eyes of the entire room on her, some looking at her with sympathy, others with judgment. She took her seat, her posture straight and her face calm, but inside, a storm was raging. As the ceremony proceeded, Maria tried to focus on the event, on the speeches and the tributes to the athletes being honored. But the man's words echoed in her mind, gnawing at the sense of pride she had felt just hours before. She had thought that her achievements would speak for themselves, that her place at this table had been earned through blood, sweat, and tears. Yet, in a matter of moments, she was made to feel like an outsider once again. Throughout the evening, Maria felt the man's gaze on her from across the room, a constant reminder of the hostility she had just faced. It would have been easy to let this moment ruin what was meant to be a night of celebration. It would have been easy to feel small, to retreat into the shadows of the room and let his prejudice define the narrative. But Maria knew she couldn't let that happen. This man's opinion didn't define her. Her value wasn't determined by whether or not he thought she belonged. She had worked too hard, come too far, to be reduced to someone else's narrow-minded view of her. As she sat there, a resolve formed within her. She needed to respond, not out of anger, but from a place of strength. This was not just about her anymore. It was about standing up against the very prejudice that countless others like her faced every day. Maria reached into her bag and pulled out a small notepad. She knew exactly what she needed to do. Maria sat quietly at the table, the echoes of the man's words still fresh in her mind. Around her, the ceremony continued with its speeches and tributes, but she felt disconnected, as if she were watching everything from a distance. She stared at the notepad in front of her, her pen hovering above the blank page. She needed to find the right words, something that would not only express how she felt, but also address the prejudice that had just unfolded in front of everyone. As she sat there, she reflected on her journey, on every moment that had led her to this very place. She thought about the early days in the dojo, the grueling training sessions, and the countless times she had faced doubt and discrimination. Every victory had come at a price. Every step forward had been a battle. And now, even in a moment that should have been purely about celebrating her accomplishments, she was reminded of how much further society had to go. Maria's initial instinct was to lash out, to confront the man and make him feel the weight of his ignorance. But she knew that approach wouldn't bring about the change she wanted to see. This was bigger than one man's opinion. It was about addressing a mindset, a deep-seated belief that people like her didn't belong in spaces like this. She needed to take the high road, not because it was easier, but because it was the path that would leave a lasting impact. She began to write, her pen moving steadily across the page. The words flowed from a place of deep conviction and experience. "Dear sir," she began, "I understand that my presence here tonight may have made you uncomfortable. I want to take a moment to explain why I am here, not just at this table, but in this sport, in this world." She continued, sharing a piece of her story. The struggles she had faced as a black woman in judo, the prejudice and the barriers she had overcome. She wrote about how the sport had shaped her, teaching her not only the techniques of combat, but also the values of respect, discipline, and honor. Maria explained that her journey was not just about winning medals. It was about breaking down the walls that society often built around people like her. "I have worked tirelessly," she wrote, "not just to excel in judo, but to challenge the narrative of who belongs where. My victories are not just my own. They belong to every girl who was told she couldn't, to every person of color who was made to feel less than. I carry their hopes and their dreams with me in every match, every competition. And yes, even here tonight," Maria paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I understand that change can be uncomfortable. It forces us to confront our own biases and the limitations we place on others. But growth comes from that discomfort, from recognizing that our differences do not diminish our humanity. We all have the right to take our place at the table, to be seen and respected for who we are and what we have achieved." She ended the letter with a simple message of hope. I hope that one day we can all look beyond the surface and see each other for the individuals we are, not as threats to the status quo, but as contributors to a richer, more inclusive world. We all have more in common than we might think. Sincerely, Maria. Maria read over the letter, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. She had spoken her truth, not with anger, but with a resolve that came from knowing who she was and what she stood for. Folding the letter neatly, she called over a nearby event coordinator and asked her to deliver it to the man. The coordinator nodded, her eyes reflecting an understanding of the gravity of what had just happened. Maria watched as the coordinator crossed the room and handed the letter to the man. He looked puzzled at first, glancing over in her direction before unfolding the paper. As he began to read, Maria observed him closely. She could see the initial look of confusion on his face slowly give way to something else. His expression softened, his eyes flicking back to the paper as if reading the words again. There was a shift in his demeanor, a quiet realization that he had not expected. For the rest of the evening, the man remained silent, the letter clutched in his hand. He seemed lost in thought, no longer glancing her way with disdain. Maria didn't expect a dramatic change or an immediate apology. What mattered to her was that she had spoken up, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt out of place because of someone else's prejudice. As the ceremony drew to a close, Maria felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The night had not gone as she had envisioned, but it had given her an opportunity to stand up for what she believed in. She had chosen to confront ignorance with grace, to turn a moment of exclusion into a chance for reflection. And in doing so, she had stayed true to the principles that judo had taught her: strength, respect, and above all, dignity. The atmosphere in the room remained subdued as the man sat with Maria's letter in his hands. His demeanor had changed from the smug, entitled air he had displayed earlier to one of quiet contemplation. For a long while he didn't move, his eyes scanning the paper again and again, as if trying to absorb every word she had written. Maria watched him from her seat, her heart steady. She didn't know if her words would make any difference to him, but she had said what needed to be said. After some time, the man stood up. There was a heaviness in his movements, a stark contrast to the arrogance he had displayed earlier. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket, then began walking toward Maria's table. The room seemed to hold its breath as he approached, the other guests keenly aware of the earlier tension between them. Maria looked up as he reached her table. For a moment he hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, the sharpness gone. "Miss Maria," he began, his eyes not quite meeting hers, "I read your letter, and I need to apologize. I was wrong." There was a sincerity in his voice that hadn't been there before. Maria watched as he took a deep breath, clearly grappling with his emotions. "I realize now that I judged you without knowing anything about you," he continued. "I made assumptions based on my own biases, and for that, I am truly sorry. Your words, they made me see things differently." He paused, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers. "I've always believed that certain spaces were reserved for certain people, and I never questioned why I thought that way. But your letter, it made me reflect on what it means to truly earn a place, not just because of who you are, but because of what you've accomplished." Maria listened to him, her face calm and unreadable. She didn't need his apology, but hearing it was still significant. It was a small sign that change was possible, that minds could be opened, even if just a little. She nodded slowly, acknowledging his words. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "It takes courage to confront our own prejudices." The man nodded, seeming almost relieved by her response. He extended his hand, his eyes searching hers for a moment of connection. "My name is David," he said, his tone now more open. "I hope that in the future, I can be part of the change you spoke about. We all need to learn to see each other beyond our differences." Maria reached out and shook his hand, feeling the significance of this small gesture. "Change isn't easy," she replied, "but it's necessary. We all have a part to play in making things better." David nodded again, looking around the room as if seeing it through new eyes. "I see that now," he said quietly, "and I will try to do better." He gave a small, almost awkward smile before turning to walk back to his seat, leaving Maria with a sense of quiet satisfaction. For the rest of the evening, David kept to himself, clearly reflecting on their interaction. The room, which had been tense earlier, began to ease into a more relaxed atmosphere. Maria felt the shift, sensing that the moment had opened up a space for dialogue and reflection. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a step, a small but meaningful shift in a long journey toward understanding and inclusion. As the event came to a close, Maria felt a sense of closure. The night had not been what she expected, but it had become something important, something that extended beyond just her. As she stood to leave, David approached her one last time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out," he said, offering the card to her. "And thank you for your words and for your patience." Maria took the card, nodding. "Thank you, David," she replied. "Take care." With that, they parted ways and Maria walked out of the hall, feeling a mix of emotions. She knew that change didn't happen overnight and that the path ahead would still have its share of challenges. But tonight, there had been a breakthrough, however small it might seem. As she stepped into the cool night air, Maria felt a sense of peace settle over her. The ceremony had started with division and hostility, but it had ended with a glimmer of understanding and respect. It was a reminder that even in moments of conflict, there was always the potential for growth and connection. And that, she realized, was a victory worth celebrating. As Maria left the ceremony, the night air was cool and crisp, a welcome contrast to the heated emotions of the evening. She walked slowly, letting the events of the night wash over her. In her hand, she still held David's business card, its presence a small but significant reminder of what had transpired. This wasn't the outcome she had imagined when she had been invited to the event, but perhaps it was the outcome that was needed. The evening had begun with a harsh reminder of the biases she had fought against her entire life. Yet it had also shown her the power of confronting those biases with patience and strength. Maria had always known that the fight against prejudice wasn't one that could be won in a single battle or through sheer force. Real change, she had come to understand, often began in quiet moments of reflection. Moments like the one that had just taken place between her and David. As she made her way to her car, Maria thought about the road ahead. She knew that while tonight's exchange was a step forward, there were still countless others who would judge her by the color of her skin or her gender before they ever saw her as the skilled athlete and person she was. That reality was a heavy burden to carry, but it was one she had accepted long ago. Her journey in judo had never just been about her personal victories. It was about challenging the limitations society imposed on people like her and paving the way for those who would follow. Maria thought of the young athletes who looked up to her, the letters and messages she had received from girls and boys inspired by her story. They were the reason she kept fighting, both on and off the mat. Every match, every public appearance, every interview was an opportunity to show them that they, too, belonged in spaces that had historically been closed to them. Her victories were their victories, proof that the barriers others placed before them could be overcome. As she drove home, she reflected on the significance of the night. David's apology had been sincere, and while it didn't erase the pain of his initial actions, it offered a glimmer of hope. If he could begin to change his perspective, perhaps others could too. Maria knew better than to believe in fairy tale endings, where prejudice disappeared overnight. But she did believe in the power of individual moments to create ripples of change. She believed in the conversations that followed such encounters, in the quiet self-reflection that could lead to a broader understanding. The road ahead would be long and challenging. There would be more events like tonight, more instances where she would have to stand her ground and demand the respect she deserved. But tonight had reinforced something crucial, that her voice had power. The letter she had written to David had not just been for him, it had been for everyone in that room, for everyone who had witnessed the exchange and perhaps questioned their own biases as a result. When Maria finally arrived home, she felt a sense of calm. She set David's card on the table, not sure if she would ever need to use it, but appreciating the gesture for what it was, a bridge, however small, between two people who had started the evening as adversaries and ended it with a shared understanding. She knew that this one interaction wouldn't change the world, but it was a start, a crack in the wall of prejudice that had stood for too long. She walked to her bedroom and looked at the medals and trophies displayed on the shelf. They were symbols of her hard work and dedication, but they also represented something more profound, the fight for acceptance, the battle for a place at the table. She picked up the latest gold medal, the one she had earned at the international competition, and held it in her hand. It was cold and heavy, a reminder of the struggles that had come with it. Maria knew that her journey was far from over. There would always be new challenges to face, new battles to fight, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. The support of her family, her community, and the countless people she inspired gave her strength. And in moments like tonight, when she stood up against prejudice and chose to respond with dignity and grace, she felt that strength echo back to her. She placed the medal back on the shelf and turned off the lights, feeling a sense of resolve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Maria lay down, knowing that each day she stood up for herself, she was also standing up for so many others. She was more than a judoka. She was a force for change, and that was a fight worth taking on every single day. As she closed her eyes, she thought of the final words she had written in her letter. We all have more in common than we might think. It was a belief she held on to, a hope that guided her actions. Because in the end, it wasn't just about judo or medals or even recognition. It was about seeing each other fully, beyond race, gender, and prejudice, and finding the shared humanity that connected them all. That, Maria knew, was the ultimate victory worth fighting for.